How's it going today, y'all? Zach with the Gearhead Automotive channel here. Just a quick video on AC repair here. Got a 2008 Honda Civic EX, and customer complaint is the AC is not cooling. About a month and a half ago, I was there for just doing regular service. He was due for oil change, tire rotation, just the basic stuff, and had mentioned that. And you know, I kind of went over the different possibilities and how I approach an initial checkup of an AC like that. So, you know, check pressures had low and high side pressure. You know, it was a classic low charge type of symptom. Evacuated the system, and sure enough, I'd have to go back in my notes to tell you exactly how much, but these hold a little over a pound on the high end of their charge. And I think it had, you know, maybe a quarter of a pound or something like that. It was significantly low. So, you know, evacuated it, like I said, saw that. Pulled a vacuum on the system just to make sure there was no air, moisture, or anything. You know, shouldn't have been because the system did still have a charge, but I like to put a vacuum on them for a little while. You know, couldn't find any signs of leaks as far as dye or anything that stood out. Charged it up. You know, AC was blowing fairly cold, but it wasn't as cold as I wanted it to be, but it wasn't a particularly hot day either, so it was hard to, even though it felt nice on the inside, it was hard to be for sure. You know, and just knowing the problems these have with compressors, the pressures looked normal, but I just didn't like what I was seeing, and so I told him, you know, drive it a little bit, let's let the dye circulate, you know, on a hot day, see how it feels to you in comparison to what you're used to. Because he had said it just seemed like between the last summer it just wasn't as cool as it had been in the past. So I got an email from him a week or so ago saying that it felt like it wasn't much cooler from that once the first hot day came around, and then it just flat out stopped cooling altogether. You know, so at that point, any number of things could happen. Leak could have given way, you know, something else. So I came back around this morning, hooked up my gauges, and static pressures were around 90 psi or so, which, you know, for the temperature it is right now is about right. Fired it up, and I'm going to show you now. So right now sitting, you know, they're not quite 100% equalized, but we are in the, you know, 120 or so on the high side and about 118 or so on the low side. You know, pretty close, but let me turn it on here for you. So you hear it kick in, come back over, you hear the fan go on. The high side pressure is slowly dropping. You see the low side is shaky a little bit. I don't know if that's coming up on that. You can see it kind of fluctuate, and high side coming down, but still, and this is actually, the symptoms changed a couple of times, or the symptom hasn't changed, but the pressure readings have changed as I've run this. When initially the low side would drop almost down to 0, and the high side would sit about, you know, 50 to 75, which initial thoughts on that, you know, that could be caused by a low charge, but you don't want to jump to that conclusion immediately. I got out my lights to start checking for dye. When I saw that, you know, shut it off and just do an initial check. But what I noticed, so there's your high side line right there. It wraps around, comes up, and goes to the condenser right in there. There's your condenser inlet. You see the smaller line down at the bottom, that's your outlet. Well, I noticed as I started looking for dye, just to see if there was anything that was standing out, I don't know if you can see, but it looks wet down there on the bottom of the condenser. But it didn't look like oil wet, it looked like moisture wet, which, you know, the high side should never be sweating any sort of moisture like the low side will, because it's not cool enough. It should never be cold ever, and it should certainly never be cool enough to allow moisture to condense on it. So that right away, you know, in your mind should signal that there's a restriction in the system. And I don't have my temp gun with me, unfortunately. I realized I left it in my other vehicle, but you know, a lot of times just feel is enough to tell on this. And so touching this line, I mean, it's red hot, what you'd expect, if not more so, which is probably the case. Unfortunately, the location of the high side port, as well as the location of the pressure sensor, is downstream of that. So if you've got a restriction here, you're never going to see that on that side as far as the pressure being real high, because that restriction is going to act like an orifice tube or an expansion valve. It's going to create a pressure drop. So touching that line there, it's good and hot, but you can touch the condenser not far away from it, and it's cool. And then down there, it's actually even cold. So, you know, I think it was a poor design to have that pressure sensor be where it's at. You know, it makes sense for the high side port to be there so it's easy to access, but had they put the pressure sensor on the line coming out of the compressor, that would have been a really valuable diagnostic tool to see that the pressure is different from one point to the other. You know, we don't need that to diagnose it, but that's something you could have seen right away on the scan tool. Also, that pressure probably would spike high enough, especially on a hot day, that the compressor would be kicking on and off, and you would see it on that end, but not on the at the pressure port on your gauge. You wouldn't see it, and you'd know right away you have a restriction. So that's enough to know that we have a restriction. Here's something else. I'm going to put you on. You can see that low side has dropped even more than high side's dropped. Watch this, and you may hear the noise it makes too. You see how quickly that low side just spiked right back up? It should take longer than that for that low side to climb up, and it should never be that high for the ambient temperature. You know, heat of the day, 100 degrees, you'll see that. But I don't know if you heard that noise coming from the compressor when it did it. That's another sign that we got major league problems. So I need to talk to him and see, you know, what his budget is right now. But this thing's going to need a whole AC system. I mean, compressor, condenser, which is going to have the dryer in it on this system, the expansion valve, and the evaporator on these. The labor is the same. You know, what's smart thing Honda did is you can pull the evaporator out without having to pull the whole dash apart. It's actually, the glove box opens up if you're not familiar with these, and the first time it's ever done, there's actually a thing you cut out with a pair of side cutters. The first time I did one on a Honda, and some of the CRVs and others use this setup as well, but you almost feel like they're tricking you into, you know, you're cutting a chunk of the dash out and it just stays out forever. But you drop this part of the evaporator case that's up under here, it comes unbolted. It's a couple hour job, I think is what the book time is. But the labor to do them is the same. So, you know, while you can flush the evaporators on these if they're not real bad, and usually the debris doesn't make it quite that far unless it's just an absolute catastrophic. You know, I've seen a few that were that bad. But I always give the customer the option on these of going ahead and putting a new evaporator in, because you're not paying any additional labor. The additional part cost is not that much when you consider. And if you can get a quality kit where that reduces the cost of the evaporator even further, it makes it that much more attractive. So it's not a, you know, if the system's not so badly contaminated that it can't be flushed, then I'll tell the customer that and let them know. But I also end up charging a little bit less labor because the time you spend flushing, I mean, you gotta be billing for that, and that varies. You know, on this system, you would just be flushing lines in the evaporator, so it wouldn't have to be a ridiculous amount of time. But I've definitely had systems that were rear AC as well. And the shop I used to work for, last shop I worked for before I went on my own, we had a Dodge Durango one time. I mean, this still to this day is the absolute worst case of contamination I've ever seen. I mean, we found powdered metal all throughout the lines of this thing. It was nuts. We had pictures of it to show the customer. But I mean, you know, it took a couple of hours to flush all of the lines and everything, you know, to the point that we felt it wasn't going to cause a repeat failure. You know, and then of course all the components that you end up having to replace, because there's no way you can ensure that you're getting all that material out of there, even on the serpentine style condensers. You know, those are generally flushable, but man, if you got one bad enough, especially for the condenser, because it's so close to where the destruction is going to occur, if there's any doubt in your mind, it's not worth the risk. You know, I mean, you can stand behind it and all the rest, but then you're coming back for free, and it's not fair to pass that on to the customer if it comes back, because they only know what you tell them, you know. So you've got to, for the most part, I mean, that's not to say there aren't savvy customers out there, but it's our job to educate our customers and give them the clearest picture we can of things, so that they can make an informed decision. You know, if they choose to make a decision that is not recommended based on that, that's a different story. And if you're gonna do work that you know is not the way because they're asking you to, make sure you document it, have them sign it, all the rest, so it doesn't come back on you, because you shouldn't be held accountable for that. And I tend to, when somebody wants to make that kind of decision, if it's something I'm still willing to do, I'll go over it with them a couple, 3 times. I mean, almost to the point that they are, you know, annoyed by it. Not that you want to annoy them, but just that they really understand how much, you know, you don't recommend this solution. Or you just refuse to do the work. You know, you bill them for the diagnostics, and there's situations like that too. I mean, you know, Ross Wellwood said in a class years ago, you know, never give a customer an option you don't want them to take. And man, I mean, that's some great advice. So anyway, I'll get off the ramble here. I just wanted to share that with you. And, you know, like I say, you see those kinds of symptoms, that kind of reading on the gauges, that is AC restriction all day long. And the only thing that's really going to come apart in an AC system is the compressor. You know, it is possible to have a dryer come apart and have desiccant in the system, but we would see the problem further downstream in this case. The dryer's over here on this side over here on the driver's side of the condenser. So there would be heat most likely further down the line, but the end result is the same. You know, compressor's got to be replaced, condenser, dryer assembly, expansion valve, and like I say, I'll give them the option of doing the evaporator while we're in there, since there's no additional labor, and then thorough flushing of the lines to make sure. So it's going to be a big repair. Need to see, you know, if this is something that's in the budget to do now, or if it's something that he's going to have to save up for. You know, this is not a good time of the year in Texas to not have air conditioning. We're here at the beginning of June, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So anyway, thanks for watching, and just remember that at Gearhead Automotive, we're fixing your car like it's our job.